This week's Antiques Roadshow comes from Henningham Hall, near Halesworth in Suffolk. Henningham is considered one of England's finest houses and is a Grade 1 listed building. Commissioned in 1777 for the Van Eyck family, the inside is the work of James Wyatt, considered by some to be the equal of Robert Adam. The gardens were laid out in 1781 by Capability Brown. One observer has said, seen from across the lake, the great house is a monumental piece of theatre. And if those sound like words from an estate agent's prospectus, then they are, because Henningham Hall is for sale. The price, a cool £4.5 million. And that's just the beginning. £500 every time you have the windows cleaned, £300 to mow the lawn, and the heating bill every month, £7,000. An additional running cost of £250,000 a year. The story of Henningham is really a metaphor for the fate of so many English country houses. A combination of death duties, expensive restoration, and high running costs means that the families for which these houses were built can no longer afford to live in them. Well, that's precisely what happened to the Van Eyck family, who were forced to leave this house after 200 years. Since then, it's passed through several hands, including the government, the National Trust, an Iraqi businessman, and a firm of accountants acting for a Kuwaiti bank. 10 years ago, a disastrous fire gutted the West Wing, which is only partially restored, and now the house is in the hands of receivers. So today offers us a rare chance to enjoy this great estate, both inside the house and in the gardens. That is, if the weather's kind to us. So let's now join our experts and the people of Suffolk.
What a splendid goblet. I suppose you haven't got a set of 6 of these, have you?
Sadly, no.
Well, you wouldn't have, of course, because it isn't a goblet.
Oh, is it not?
No, it's a goblet shape,
yes.
But in fact, it's almost certainly a punch bowl. And it doesn't take too much detective work to work out on what occasion a punch bowl like this might have been used.
That of a presumably a wedding or something like that, or
Well,
some great
no,
occasion.
let's look at the designs, because here we have...
Hunting.
Well, not hunting. No, here we have a design of 2 rather aggressive cockerels facing one another.
Yes.
If we move to the next panel, they seem to be pecking at one another. And sure enough, it is a cockfighting bowl, because there we have the action in full progress.
Oh, yes.
And finally, we have the victor sitting on top of the vanquished, and rather grisly little drops of blood dropping down from his beak. So this was a bowl not for a wedding, but for the death of a cockerel, or the death of several cockerels, and it would have been something from which the gentleman, if that's what we can call them, present at the time, would have lifted toddies. The date is probably somewhere between 1820 and 1860. There's nothing specific either about the shape or about the engraving to be absolutely certain. But the engraving is actually of a very high quality, and they've gone to the extra trouble of introducing gilding into the trellis design that forms the background of the whole piece. And I bet if we pick it up...
Yes, what a lovely sound. Yes.
Fabulous.
Yes.
How did you come by it?
Well, my father-in-law acquired it in Kenya in about 1926, I think it was.
In Kenya?
In Kenya, from someone else, another farmer. I think it was a Prince Galitzine. And he was selling up. My father-in-law went to the sale.
Right.
And acquired these objects.
And so he acquired this also?
He also acquired that as well.
Well, now, that is interesting, because that glass, of course, had got to Kenya from England. But this piece of glass had got to Kenya from the Low Countries. And you say it came from Prince Galitzine?
Well, that's what I was told, or believe.
Well, I
And
believe
it's
it.
1 of
I
12.
believe it too. 1 of 12.
Well, I understand it was 1 of 12, but I don't know.
Well, the reason why I believe it is that on this side we have the twin-headed eagle of the Romanovs and the crown, and sure enough, on the other side we have then the monogram. This style of glass can go back to the 18th century, but in fact this piece of glass is probably 19th century in date. But a set of 12, it's a shame.
Well, so I believe.
It's a shame we didn't have the other 11.
Isn't it a tragedy?
Do you know how much he paid?
I have no idea, no. Well, none at all.
Well, for the bowl here that we looked at earlier, that I would imagine would fetch today somewhere between £800 and £1,200.
good heavens, yes, yes.
But this, which has strong Romanov interest, and collectors of Russian memorabilia in particular go for this sort of thing, I would imagine that a glass like that today would fetch anywhere between £1,000 and £2,000.
Lovely, although it's only one, it's not a set.
Well, there was a set sold in London, a much smaller set, where the eagles and all the detail were picked out in gilding in black enamel. Yes. So I'm basing that sort of valuation on that.
Yes. Well, I think it's very beautiful.
Do you use it at all?
No, I'm afraid I don't. I'll have to start that now, won't I? Yes.
Well, at first glance, it is, as I'm sure you know, a very good early 19th century mahogany Georgian breakfast table. And there's one thing that is slightly wrong with it when you look at it from the end, rather than from where you and I are standing, is that the pedestal isn't actually in the middle. And you've got a curious bit of leaf there that is actually separate from there to you. So what you've really got is one of those clever adaptations of about 1800 to 1810 of part of a huge dining table, of which this was one end, and then you had two center pedestals, and then another one of these at maybe 20 feet away. And each of the end ones had a little leaf like that to turn it into the occasional breakfast table when a smaller party was required for. Now, the big question is, do you have the rest of it?
No, unfortunately not.
Okay, so where did this bit come from?
Well, this was given to my husband's great-grandmother as a wedding present, and she worked at Glenham Hall.
Oh, right. And I wonder where the rest is. I mean, there's no telling now.
No, I'm curious as to know as well.
Well, yes, I mean, somewhere along the line, somewhere in the country, there will be at least 2 other pedestals, and there should be 3 others. 4 pedestal tables are extremely rare. 3 pedestal tables are very sought after. The interesting thing is that in the 18th and 19th century, grand furniture was bought by people from the around villages and surrounding squire houses and farmhouses, and it wasn't fashionable for titled people to go to house sales. So every time a piece of furniture was sold, it went into a smaller house. And so that's why around grand houses you do find lots of wonderful bits of furniture, unfortunately reduced in size. The other thing, of course, is that a breakfast table of this I would normally tip lengthways, whereas this one has a catch here, so it tips vertically rather than horizontally. And underneath, it shows immediately a couple of the faults which are, you know, common with this type of table. When you think about it, the design is not good because all the weight from the table is on this center block. That's the main problem. You don't have any other problems with it. Now, these little dents along the top, these are caused by, actually, they're a very good sign of authenticity. They're usually caused by a little girl who screwed her needlework clamp on. Is that right?
No, unfortunately. It was grandmother with the mincer.
On this table?
Yes.
Well, furniture should be used. A mincer. Now, what about value? Have you got it valued at all?
No, I had a quote about 8 years ago for about £500.
Well, as a breakfast table and part of a lot, this end would probably be worth about £3,500, £4,000.
Really?
And if you've got the other one to match it, it would be worth about £15,000. And if you could find the centre table to make it into your 20-foot table, it's £50,000 or £60,000. So have a hunt round the area and let me know, all right?
I will.
Okay, very good. Thank you.
Do you actually know what this is?
I assumed it's some form of timepiece.
Yeah, it's in fact a horizontal sundial, and they're known as Butterfield dials because they are actually made by Butterfield of Paris. He was a prolific maker of sundials in the early part of the 18th century. We've actually got it sitting here perfectly orientated for the north, but being the middle of summer in England, there's just no chance there would be any sun, so I could show you how it works. But you have a compass fitted in it. Then you have the gnomon, as it's called, and it's called the bird gnomon because it's a form of a bird. In fact, on this side, he's actually lost the very tip of his beak. But the scale there, you see, and this will slide up and down, and you can set it for the correct latitude.
Yes.
So depending on where you are. Now, on the back of the dial, if we turn it over, you've got all the latitudes of France, the major towns of France. You've got Metz, Saint-Malo, Mons, Belgium as well, of course. They vary slightly, and of course the time by the sun will vary according to your latitude. You haven't got a little box with it, have you?
No, I'm afraid not, no.
All right, because they do all have a little fitted case in shagreen. Yes. So coming back to this side, if having set your latitude, taking it from the back for what town you want, the closest town, you set the latitude here, and then you've got 3 chapter rings. You see 52 degrees, 48 degrees, and 46 degrees. And you orientate it with the compass. The sun should strike the gnomon, and it will pass the shadow down, and you read it off on whichever chapter ring is closest to the one for the latitude of the town you're at. You can get quite an accurate idea of the time. They aren't particularly rare. There are a lot of fakes. There's no question this is genuine. They're rarer in silver than in brass. They come in quite varying sizes, perhaps down to half that size and up to 3 or 4 times.
I see, yeah. Who would you actually use this sort of instrument, sorry?
Effectively, anybody who was wealthy enough to own one, because the watches at that time, we're talking about the early 18th century, were very unreliable and very scarce, and of course you couldn't ring up the Tim and ask for the time.
Right,
you couldn't, and the only chance you had was a church clock, so anywhere between a major town with a church clock, there was no way of resetting a watch.
Yes, I see.
Any thoughts on that? Well, I can tell you that a good one, a pity it hasn't got the case, but a good one like that's probably worth of the order of about £600 to £800.
I see, it's quite nice. Nice to know that.
Yeah. You didn't find it in the attic, did you?
No, it's just been handed down, as I say. It's just wrapped in a piece of tissue paper and it's been in the drawer, yeah.
Probably brought back from the Napoleonic Wars or something. Somebody nicked it on the battlefield.
Now, you've brought along something that really will feel very much at home in a house like this, because every great country house, like Henningham, would have had, in the 18th century, an armorial dinner service. And they would get them from China.
I see.
Do you know anything about these?
Not really, no. I know they've been in the family, well, ever since I can remember.
Unfortunately, one doesn't carry around with them a book to look up these coat of arms.
No, I was wondering how one could find out which family.
You could find it out very easily by looking in a book called Papworth's Ordinary British Armorials, where you can look them up, but you have to understand how the heraldry works to do it.
Yes.
All I can tell you is that here we have a gentleman and his crest, and he appears to have married an heiress, because this coat of arms, which what's called in pretense, is presumably that of his wife, who was an heraldic heiress. The date in or around 1760.
Oh.
As has so often happened with these services, they've suffered a bit.
Yes.
Almost the one that's cracked in half is in best condition, because it's obviously got cracked in half and stuck together again, and then nobody used it any longer. So they're a splendid lot of great historic interest, and I think a perfect one's probably worth £600.
Really?
Yes. So still, I think the upset value of the whole lot is between £1,500 and £2,000.
Really?
It's a pity about the condition, because they really are, and they must have been, think of an 18th century table laid with these, how magnificent they must have been.
I know at the beginning of the war, my mother thought they were rather nice and didn't want them to be bombed, so she took them to an antique shop opposite Harrods, and he offered her £5 a plate for them, so she decided perhaps they, might hold on to them, so she took them back, buried them underneath the stairs till after the war, and then took them out again, so that's...
I think they're really splendid.
Thank you.
Most beautiful.
This is not a first edition, by the way. This is 1760, 1770 is the date. The first edition was printed in 1669. And he was given, for the copyright of this, he tried to sell it, but he was given for the copyright of this magnificent work £10, which he sold all his rights to. But there happened in the 18th century, this 18th century edition, 2 printers, one of them called Baskerville and the other one called Fowles. Now, they were book collectors, and they went on to become booksellers, and they went on to become printers. And their idea was to produce a book, not that with tight type, but a book that you could actually read. And as we open this and have a look at it, you can actually see that every word is clear. It's very easy to read. Apart from the fact that the F's or S's, if you can stomach that, that's fine. This is a wonderful, beautiful edition. But the thing that I think is more extraordinary than just a Fowles Press edition is the fact that you have it bound so sumptuously. It really is the most elaborate binding for an edition of this sort. And can I just show you the difference between the front, which has been rather dust-stained, and the back, which is so much brighter, is tremendous. Now, an ordinary edition of a Fowles Press Paradise Lost would be worth in the region of about £200 to £300. But I feel, in this condition, this is worth in the region of about 800 to 1,000.
That is amazing.
Tell me,
Absolutely amazing.
It's a family piece, I hope.
Yes, it is a family piece, and
Yes.
I bought it just on the spur of the moment, at the very last minute this morning. I just wondered whether it would be worth anything. I had thought about taking it to London, but it's so heavy.
Well, I don't see there's any problem with it. I mean, I would happily carry that away with me.
Yeah.
No trouble
Yes,
with
I
that
shall
at
go
all.
home a lot happier than I came with it. Thank you.
Jolly good. Thank you very much.
Well, it belonged to 3 maiden aunts of mine who lived in a remote Cotswold village, and it's been in the family quite a long time. It was left to my mother, and then she passed it down to me.
Well, being in Suffolk, and perhaps it may be too hasty a conclusion, but when I saw the painting, I thought, well, this looks very much like a Constable portrait. Now, before we can say that it is definitely by Constable, it's obviously necessary to do a lot of research. It's unlikely that pictures by great artists turn up.
Yes.
And I don't want to mislead you, but it was certainly the likeness and the style of the painting certainly suggested to me that it might well be by John Constable. Now, he wasn't actually that a sophisticated portrait painter. His style wasn't actually that slick and finished. And that is one of the things which I'm afraid is obvious in the way this painting has been portrayed. But in a way, that's also a good thing. The neck here and this rather sloping shoulder is very characteristic of the way he did his head portraits now. Now, I may be proved wrong, but I think we have to do some more work on the picture. We've got to have it cleaned, and it would clean really quite well. It may be rather unfair to talk about value, because as a 19th century, early 19th century portrait of an unknown sitter by an unknown artist, if it was clean, one might say it's worth probably £500 to £1,000. But we must consider the outside chance, and it is an outside chance, that it is by Constable. And we would have to mention figures in the region of 30 to 50,000, if that was actually true. But as I say, we've got a lot of work to do, and I would like to carry out that research for you and show it to one or two of the established experts to make sure one way or the other.
Oh, that'd be marvellous.
And let's hope for some good news.
Well, thank you very much.
All right.
That's good.
The thing I like about this is the crazy way in which they've painted these rocks.
Yes.
This technique is called penciling. Instead of doing what they normally do here, which is shading by doing this sort of thing with the brush, what they've done here with the other rocks is that they've actually penciled in the texture. Turning it over, there we've got a lozenge mark. This is simply what is known as a commendation mark. A mark which commends the piece to the owner. The shape is very typical. This groove is something you get around the 1700 period, and of all the 4 pieces you brought, that I would say is my favourite because of the rarity of the design and the pattern.
Yes, yes.
It's probably worth somewhere in the region of £600 to £900.
Is it? Oh, nicely. I shall have to find out where I can sell it.
Well, that's not my job to
No,
tell
I know
you.
it isn't.
Wherever we go with the Antiques Roadshow, we usually find 1 or 2 things that are peculiar to that part of the world. And that's certainly true of our next 2 items. They're rather impressive-looking punt guns, and they were used in the hunting of wildfowl, particularly here in Suffolk, but also on the rivers and estuaries of Norfolk and Essex. Bill, I wouldn't have thought that a flock of duck or geese would stand much of a chance in front of one of these.
No, Hugh, that's right. With a really skilled gunner, you would stand a fairly good chance of taking 20 or 30 at a go. But you have to bear in mind that the people who shot duck in this manner did it
for a living, as market gunners, rather than as sportsmen.
Now, how did these punt guns work? I mean, by their very name, they were sighted on the front of a punt.
Yes.
Used on the rivers and estuaries. But, I mean, with a gun like this, the recoil must have been enormous.
Yes, it is. It's frightening, and they were secured to the front of the deck of the punt using this large stanchion here, and the spring in the front of it took up some of the recoil, but the majority of it would be taken up by a series of very thick breeching ropes that went over the prow and through this loop here, so that when the gunner fired it, it didn't come back in his face. But what did happen was that the punt ran backwards with it.
Who would pay money for these today, and what sort of money would they pay if they were collecting them?
Well, the wildfowling community, who like to keep artifacts relevant to their activity, are always very interested in punt guns, and there is always a great buzz of interest when a good one appears on the market. And certainly for this big lad here, you would expect to pay somewhere around about £1,000 for it.
Really?
But you need a big wall to hang it on, I can tell you.
Right.
This pair of vases, of course, marked Granger, Lee & Co. Worcester. Actually, interestingly, without the mark, one would have been a little bit dangerous to have said who they were.
Yes.
They were like a lot of Staffordshire productions, but this made in Worcester by Grangers. And the decoration with these lovely flowers is the work of David Evans, who was a painter who came up from Wales, from the Swansea factory.
Yes.
When Swansea went bust, he turned up at the Granger factory in Worcester and brought this very sophisticated Welsh style of flower painting to Worcester. One very characteristic thing about David Evans' work is the running off of little tiny sprigs.
Yes.
You get little tiny little sprigs of flowers with the main flower, and then these little bits just sparkle off like that. A super pair of vases. How did you get them?
My father bought them in Ludlow about 25 years ago, and they've come down to me.
Jolly nice. One is crazed heavily, which is a shame, and I suppose reduces the value very much. But what did your father pay for them?
We think around 80 to 100
At 80 to
pounds.
100, and that's 25 years or so ago.
Yes.
I suppose in value now, a pair like this with one a little bit scruffy-ish looking is probably going to be £1,000.
As much as that?
Yes,
Oh,
so
that's
they're
marked.
jolly nice.
Thank you very
but
much.
enjoy them, and I think they're
I
great,
shall.
great pieces.
It's relatively modern, you know, it's only 60, 70 years old, and yet it's a classic of its type. They're so-called Mouseman furniture.
Yes.
Now, the reason for that is that on every piece of this table and set of chairs, there is a carved mouse. In this case, you can see it running up the arm, and this is the distinctive trademark of a man called Robert Thompson of Kilburn, Yorkshire, who is known as the Mouseman carver. He started making furniture just before the First World War in his father's local carpentry business. And in the 1920s, he went out on his own and established a tradition for making, in a sense, country furniture, handmade, to reflect the traditions of William Morris and the arts and crafts movement of the late 19th century. And the tradition that he established was then carried on by his children.
So it's still being made.
And it's still being made today. If you go to Kilburn in Yorkshire today, the whole town is taken over by woodwork workshops. And there are people whose mark is a squirrel, a bee, all sorts of other symbols have arisen. But the really desirable pieces are always the original Mouseman pieces. Now, I have to ask you, in this set, why are there only 7 chairs?
During the war up in Yorkshire, my grandmother lent her house to the American servicemen, and during a particularly cold winter, one of them decided to chop up one of the chairs and use it as firewood.
So it's a sacrifice for the war effort, you could say.
Well, it's a pity. But
well, all I can say is thank God they stopped there.
Yes, so
it's in a sense, it's spoilt the set, because there's now 7 chairs, 2 carvers, and there should have been 8, of course.
Yes.
But that doesn't stop it being a very desirable and a very important piece of 20th century English furniture. I would go really quite high on a set like this with the family history. 6,000 to 8,000 would be perfectly acceptable,
Really?
I would think.
It's true.
So
it was a 21st birthday present
for you
as well. Yes.
Well, you're very lucky.
So it's mine.
I wish it was mine. Hang on to it.
Do you know what this is meant to be? This object?
No, not originally. All I know is when my mother had it, she just used it for growing hyacinths.
Well, a lot of people use them as flower pots.
Yeah.
And it's actually what's called a brush pot, and it's where an artist kept his paintbrushes. It's Chinese, made about 1700, in the reign of the Emperor Kangxi, but I think almost certainly made for export to the West. this kind of ware was exported to houses like this, in fact. And with lovely figures drawn all the way around it. And there's a typical feature here of this kind of porcelain. You see, they did the drawing, and they did the drawing around the figures, and then they washed it in. They've just sort of filled it in with a wash.
Yeah.
Now, there's another thing I have to tell you about this, which is very important. When you turn it up, it has a 4-character mark.
Yeah.
Now, if you look that mark up in a book, you'll find that that is the mark of a Ming emperor, Cheng Hua, who was a 16th century emperor. But this is consistent with Chinese practice of putting earlier marks on pieces.
Yeah.
But everything about this, the way the base is made, with this recess here, with this washed-in drawing I told you about, and the shape, this is typical of a Kangxi piece made in about 1700. So I have to tell you that you should insure it for about £2,500.
It belongs to a friend of mine. I believe her father-in-law bought it when he was in Kenya, about 1925.
Right, well, it's an electrifying bronze in every sense, because this is the work of a French master bronze maker called Pierre Jules Menne. Menne was one of the foremost sculptors known as animaliers, and they broke away from the sort of romantic and historical type of subjects which were very popular in France and Europe during the 1830s, 40s and 50s, and they developed this wonderful naturalistic style which came as a breath of fresh air to people. People were getting a bit tired of classical semi-naked nymphs. They wanted something different, and the French provided it with this type of figural group. But the quality of this is in a top league for the simple reason is, to my mind, it's an early casting. And why is it an early casting? Because of the definition. I mean, let me turn it around, because it's all happening around here. I mean, this man didn't just know horses, he loved horses. And today, the horse is a very, very popular subject. Now, I wouldn't be surprised if this particular figural group had people competing at auction and paying well in excess of maybe £3,000. So,
it's beautiful.
So tell me, where did you find these paintings?
I bought them at an auction in Norfolk.
And were they catalogued as old?
No.
They weren't
there was no catalogue.
You see, the thing that struck me about these pictures is that they are all modern paintings, and yet they're all framed to look as though they're old.
Yes.
And if the definition of a fake is that it is deliberately made to deceive somebody, then in my opinion, these are fakes. To take this sporting painting here, it definitely is a new painting put into a frame very carefully. But what is interesting is that it has old labels on the back.
Yes.
It's got a handwritten label which is ostensibly meant to look old.
Yes.
It's dated, and then the whole thing is sprayed over to make it look as though it's got a lot of age. But in fact, it's all a brand new production, brand new probably within the last 5 or 10 years. And of course, somebody's planting them in sales. And what did you pay, for instance, for this picture?
For this one, I think it was £150.
Yes. And you hope that you bought something rather cheaply.
Yes.
In other words, the man who produced these, if it were he, for instance, who set them up in the sale, got probably £100 or £120 more than if he were selling them as straightforward modern pastiches, which is a polite way of putting it.
Ah, there it is. There's the Meissen mark. There it is, you see it? And underneath the pommels of the crossed swords, there are 2 little scratched lines, and they indicate that the porcelain was a second, and that therefore they didn't wish to proceed with decorating it at the factory. So sure enough, it went on elsewhere to be decorated. So it's Meissen, but not Meissen.
nodding Mandarin figures were made by the Mouseman factory from the early 18th century onwards. It's almost one of the first things they made. But this is undoubtedly a 19th century example. But it is Mouseman, and the fact that it was decorated outside doesn't make too much difference to the price. Did you buy it?
No, it's been handed down in my husband's family.
Handed being the operative word.
Literally.
I think that if that were to go up for auction today, it would fetch somewhere between £2,000 and £3,000. So it's quite a good hand done, isn't it?
Not too bad.
Would you like to tell me about this picture here?
Yes. We bought that yesterday in an auction locally.
Is that the same auctioneers?
No, this was Suffolk.
Did you think this is by the same... Well, I mean, it's in the same frame.
Yeah. We just turned the back over and then we realised.
Just turned them over and said snap, didn't
Snap,
we?
yeah.
In fact, it's the same label. Both the same horse, the same date.
Yes.
Did you think yours was 1877?
Presume so, yes.
Yeah.
Well, I think there is somebody here, around here, producing these things. And I suggest that this is reported, A, to the auctioneers you bought them from, and perhaps, to the police.
I don't believe the picture in the middle.
Yeah, I put that in there.
Oh, you did? Right. Originally, what I would expect to have found in the centre would be a miniature portrait of a lady or gentleman. This marvellous decoration here, the shells, the acanthus sleeve, and of course, it's gilded.
Yes.
Silver covered with gold. The date, in fact, that little D, it's a London hallmark, and although the leopard's head is not there, that's actually for 1819. And the maker, the PR, very important maker.
Really?
Philip Rundle, of the firm of Rundle, Bridge and Rundle. Their nicknames were Oil and Vinegar. And Rundle, whose mark we see on this piece, was Vinegar. It was a right so-and-so. Two extraordinary characters. It's a very difficult thing to put a value on. I would say at least £2,000. And in the right sort of sale, I could see that really going away. So it would not surprise me to see it selling for significantly more than that.
Good heavens.
Most people think of air guns as being a relatively modern invention, but in fact they are actually really quite ancient, and they have been around as long as guns and certainly gunpowder. This particular one is interesting in that it dates from the mid part of the 19th century, and it's retailed by Cogswell and Harrison of London, and we know that their firm set up in 1860, so it dates from somewhere, I think, slightly before that. It would have been unlikely that they would have made it. It would have been made, I would have thought, in Birmingham, right, or by a specialist maker somewhere in London, and then they would have merely retailed it. Yes. And I think it's always quite important that people learn, when you actually see names on the top, that it wasn't necessarily the man who signed it who actually made it. Now, to use it, that you would actually have used this part of the gun, which isn't just a stock, it's also an air reservoir. Yes. And using the pump that you are holding, that would have been screwed into the neck here, and you'd given it 200 or 300 pumps. Or if you were sensible, you would have got your butler to do it. Because this is a quality weapon that would have been used by a gentleman sportsman, albeit it was greatly favoured by poachers if they could get them, obviously because of its silence. And there is quite a sad story. There was a gentleman who had one of these air guns who got his butler to pump it up, and unfortunately the reservoir was faulty and it exploded and killed this unfortunate chap.
One of the reasons I've never dared use it. Just
yes, no, I think you're very wise. They are extremely fragile, and if we look on the butt here, which is covered in sharkskin or shagreen, there are some little cracks appearing in it, and you don't quite know what it's like in there, and it's only thin iron soldered, and if you were to overcharge it, it could well be quite dangerous. But it's a quality weapon, and as such, they are very desirable to collectors because they're very unusual. You don't see very many of them, and consequently they have a fairly high price. Have you given any thought as to what it might be worth?
Well, I bought it approximately a year ago, and I paid £1,000 for it. So
I think it's worth very slightly more than that. I would have said somewhere around about 1,200. So really? I think you have paid about the market price for it. So I think that you've got a good investment here, and it's in good condition, and it's a nice set, and I I think that once you've paid the market price for it, that you will eventually, should you decide to dispose of it, actually realise on it.
Thank you very much.
Well, we just moved up from London and we were looking around for one or two bits of nice-ish furniture, and we saw this, and I said, gosh, that is absolutely gorgeous. And they wanted £175 for it. And I said, I have got some money put aside. I said to my wife, and she said, oh, but hang on, you've got that money put by to buy a spare Bentley gearbox, haven't you? I said, well, yes. I said, I might be able to find another gearbox before long, but we will not find another one of these.
Wonderful. Very. How much would a Bentley gearbox cost now?
An 8-out close ratio box, 8,000.
Right, right. Furniture like this, while it's very beautiful, has long outrun its original usage. And therefore, you know, you find gentlemen's dressing chests, which is what this is, converted to cocktail cabinets or anything else that might fit today's home rather than its original use. This is a piece of furniture which you can date and relate straight back to Hepplewhite's drawing book, published in the 1770s, and we know that's when it was made. And it had so many various uses that we put this in a bachelor's flat, and he needed no other piece of furniture whatsoever to afford himself reasonable comforts to a good standard of living.
Absolutely.
This was intended, as I say, as an all-in-one piece.
Right.
And so over there you would have had a pot cupboard, little pot drawer.
Yes.
To excuse yourself. And here you had a bidet, hence these sort of sloped chamfered sides. That would have had a liner in and a little zinc pot in there.
Hence the expression polishing the mahogany.
Absolutely, yes, it is, absolutely. Then you've got a drawer for various powders and unctions and linen. And here, after having seen to the other ablutions, you then made yourself clean and respectable in this one. And you had a bowl, a lead liner. This would have taken soap. And then you've got a little plug at the end, and that, of course, let the water drain should there be any spillage. So that was all settled. And then, in order to make yourself look presentable, there would have been a mirror. And here would have been your wig tidies, your powder for wig, cash, etc., etc. And then, having done all that, you got to a nice part of the day, and then you could pull out the centre slide, and that would have been your, you could do that, the writing slide. Perfect. As far as value is concerned, I don't think at the moment it's actually kept up quite with your gearbox. Right. A good, sensible value for this, for insurance purposes, would be about £6,000. But it certainly was anything but a bad investment, and you've had a lot of fun out of this, I'm sure.
A lot of pleasure. Love looking at it every day.
Well,
and we use it, you know, keep things in it. It's
well, then that's priceless.
Eminently usable.
Well, this is a pretty dramatic portrait, and it's pretty obvious why, isn't it? Because it's of Ellen Terry, one of the most famous actresses of her age.
With such presence, yes.
When did you buy it?
I bought it about 3 years ago.
For any particular reason, just because you thought it was wonderful?
Well, the theatrical connection fascinated me. Her presence on the canvas fascinated me. I'm also an actress, so this had something special for me.
You know who it's by?
No, I don't know who it's by. I have no idea.
When we first look at it, we'd say, well, where does this paint come from? I mean, who painted like this? And the answer really is Sir John Everett Millais, the great Pre-Raphaelite artist who then became president of the Royal Academy and painted these wonderful dramatic pictures. It's not by Millais, by the way, but it is a marvellous picture. In fact, it's by the Honourable John Collier, who was almost contemporary with Ellen Terry. She was born in 1848, he was born in 1850. As for price, because she's a famous lady and a theatrical lady, and the theatre's doing quite well at the moment, in certain ways, I think somewhere around £10,000 to £15,000, maybe even more.
Well, that's certainly more than I paid for her, so that's pleasing as well.
Well, I think congratulations on buying a marvellous picture.
Thank you.
I mean, it really is an extraordinary miniature, isn't it?
Well, it's a family heirloom, and I know that my father was given it to him in the 1920s, by his great aunt. There were two, in fact, and another
There were
relative.
two?
There were two. There was.
Where's
there
the
was,
other one? Where's the
we
other
don't
one?
know. The other one was of the heavens, he says.
Yeah, the celestial.
And another cousin of his had the other one.
And
when
you
they
don't
were
know
small
who?
boys. No. And he gave it to me when I was a child, and I think that accounts for some of the damage on it.
Yes, the damage. Well, I'm glad you brought that up, because I was just going to say it gives us a rather good opportunity. The globe itself is of paper, the gauze as they're called, and onto a base, was a plaster and composition base, and the lacquer on it is shellac, which is natural vegetable sort of lacquer, and over the years the shellac darkens. And what's happened is where you've damaged it, fortunately you've only just chipped it a bit, you haven't broken holes in it. If you hit this with hard enough or dropped it on the floor, you'd actually crack the whole globe, and then you'd have a big problem. You can actually see through the dirty shellac where the original colouring of the prints are. And of course it was all originally hand-coloured. There's a very big arguments about whether it should or should not be cleaned. A lot of people like, at this point, because it's chipped, they would take off this lacquer and re-lacquer it with a cleaner material so you could actually see the design better. Other people would say, oh, no, the patina, you must leave it, you mustn't touch it. It has got a name on it. There are several makers of these, Carey, Bardin, different makers. This is actually a Smith, and it's marked Smith's terrestrial globe, exhibiting the whole of the discoveries of the different circumnavigations, etc., etc. And in fact, if you go over the globe very carefully, you can actually see Cook's Track, Clark's Voyage, Jardine's, and they're all marked on there. One of the ways of dating them is always the state to which Australia has actually been discovered, and here it's virtually complete. And I would date this one in the sort of early part of the 19th century. Well, I think you're going to have to go back in the family records and you're going to have to find your cousin, because there was a pair of these in rather better condition, but these are not, they certainly can be restored, that were sold for considerably in excess of £10,000.
Goodness. So it's worth having it restored, is it? Or
that was a pair. That was a pair, considerably in excess of £10,000. As a single, it's not such good news. It's probably worth 5 or 6 thousand.
A nice thing for me to pass down the family.
Absolutely.
Well, you know, it really has been the most remarkable day here, good for us in all departments, but particularly in porcelain and pictures. And if that painting does indeed turn out to be a Constable, we will, of course, let you know in a future programme. The other extraordinary thing about today has been the sheer numbers of people that we've seen. Because we're here in the middle of rural Suffolk, we thought the attendance might be below average. Indeed, it's been exactly the contrary. People have come from a radius of about 100 miles. Well, we very much hope that you'll join us next week at the same time when we take cameras and experts across the Irish Sea to Cork. Until then, from all of us here in Suffolk, goodbye.
The Antiques Roadshow regrets that it cannot give any valuations by post.